Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. I have another conversation for you today, this one from my friend Anthony. Anthony is actually Sarah's fiance. I talked to Sarah in one of my previous videos, and they're actually together, so a little behind the scenes fun. Anyways, he actually asked me to have a conversation with him about the Scape Goat atonement theory. And I had no idea what it was about or where he wanted to take it. But I said, all right, I'll talk to you about it, but let's do it for the podcast. And he said, okay. So that's what we did. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I loved the places where it went and, Anthony's thoughts on how sort of this theory of atonement and the way that works within our world reflects itself in so many ways in our modern participation in big ideas and religion. So I hope you enjoy it too. You want to just talk real quick so I can get a
Testing
sense?
1, 2, 3. BurgerFi makes great burgers.
This is not sponsored by BurgerFi. Not a sponsor.
Well, one day.
That'd be great. If BurgerFi wants to sponsor me, I'm happy for it.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Anthony.
Yes.
Welcome to my home. Thanks for coming by.
I'm glad to be here. This is a pretty official looking setup you have here, way better than mine.
Did you think it would be this official?
No, I did not.
You didn't know what you're walking into? Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I always ask people to just give a brief, bio, like who are you? So people who don't know you, what they need to know, what you want them to know.
Yeah. So my screen name or handle that often you'll see is Lyman Lux, LIMENLUX, which is kind of like a play on liminal, the idea of being liminal or threshold, and then lux, light, so light from the threshold. I guess I'm into that type of thing. But about me, I like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I love to grapple. And I'm a Freemason, and so like those two things kind of like make up a lot of where I spend my time, like Freemason, and then marketing. I have a background in marketing. I've been in that. So the three things of where I spend a lot of my time and energy and kind of obsessive about is Freemasonry, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and marketing.
Cool. Yeah, that about sums you up.
Yeah, that sums me up.
So you're here today because you wanted to have a conversation with me about scapegoat theory.
Yes.
Okay. I have not done any research about it. I came in blind because I wanted you to I wanted to hear your opinion and kind of hear why you thought it was important and try to understand it from your perspective. So I'll hand it off to you to start.
Okay.
What is it? Why do you want to talk to me about it? And yeah, kind of for someone who has no idea what it is, how would you explain it?
So the thing that I think is important, well, first is that many people who are Christian and in Christian circles know of basically one atonement theory. Like Christ died to pay your sin debt, and it's this exchange of, you owed a debt, sin debt to God, and Jesus pays it, and then you can, now he pays for your debt. That kind of the penal substitution, what is what it's referred to as. And that's like the main atonement theory that most Christians kind of know about.
Pretty common, like Protestant evangelical
cultures, yes. And that's where I come from, like that culture. And I was astonished when I first found out that there's kind of a lot of different theories on atonement.
Yeah.
And some of them are the Christus Victor, where, and then some of them are the moral exemplar, where Jesus is basically the example. And so he died so he can be an example of what it means to be a good person. Or he died to plunder the devil of his goods, and things like that. And there was one of the more recent ones, which I thought was just so insightful and didn't get as much press, didn't get as much popularity as I would have wanted, but I thought was very telling, especially applying to today, is called the Scape Goat theory. Mm-hmm. So it's basically one of 7 theories of atonement. And the scapegoat theory is the idea that, I guess to put it in short, is that we mimic each other's desire. Like, you don't really want an iPhone. You want an iPhone because I want an iPhone, or like you don't really want this type of car. We all just mimic each other.
I don't want an iPhone. I want a dumb phone.
But we like mimic each other, and so like a lot of times we think that we come up with our own desires, and so what we do is we borrow our desire from a model, like this person that we look up to, and you look at that person, and I look at like this is what we want to be, and that builds up, and then eventually you come to the point where the society may fail or something may go wrong. And the way that you try to, you kind of like look around for somebody to lay the blame on. And you don't want to blame yourself because, well, you want to preserve your positive perspective on yourself, so you blame someone else. And the idea is that what happened with Jesus was our mimetic desire got out of control, and we were blind to it, to the point where we needed somebody to blame for why the church was failing. And so Jesus was somebody who stood out as not mimicking us, and so we scapegoated him. But that was like kind of the awakening of the first time we realized that we are scapegoating innocent people, clearly. So I don't know if that was a roundabout way of it.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to get my head around it. It's basically this idea that we pick up on each other's wants, desires, and then that becomes or feeds into what we think we want or how we should live. And through that, it ends up creating sort of this, what's the word? Almost like an anti-response, where when something doesn't go the way that you want, you then attribute that pain onto somebody else to take the blame instead of putting it on ourselves.
Right.
And so then Jesus would be this clearly innocent person that gives us a model to understand mimetic desires. Is that what it's?
Yeah. Okay. So
this is getting very technical.
Okay. So the reason why I thought it was important, because people will try to come up with one of the things that makes Christianity unique, and we have say, oh, the incarnation, which is something, right? But and we would say, oh, Christianity is unique, and then sometimes we make up stuff that's like it's not really unique to Christianity. And
what would be an example? Like, would you say?
That an example that's not unique to Christianity is, that's actually a good question, Bruno. So, what's something that people often think? Well, I guess to some low level, people will think that not having sex before marriage is something that only Christianity teaches, and there's like other, and honestly, there's a lot of overlap between the Abrahamic religions themselves.
Yeah.
But one of them that is, I think, pretty unique and points to a time in our evolution of consciousness is the time where we realized that we as a society are pathological in our desire to blame others. And so Jesus was like the first epiphany or awakening that we have the propensity to scapegoat good people, and like on the behalf of our own ego, our own societal wanting to feel good about ourselves. And before then, pretty much in mythology, the scapegoat was somebody who was guilty. It was like, oh, this person deserved it. Oedipus, that was a deserving person, like all these different ones who died. And in this instance, that person was innocent. So it's like, okay, so society came to awakening that they can have this kind of crowd mentality, this mob mentality, and it will just find anyone to sacrifice. And sometimes it may be a guilty person, but sometimes it can be an innocent person. And that's why I like the scapegoat theory, because it enlightens that aspect of human nature that I think is reprehensible.
Okay. And in my mind, I connected it to some of these patterns in the Torah and sort of some of the traditions that they had with sacrifices and offering, and in some of the early law, they do have the sort of scapegoat sacrifice. Have you learned anything about that in the connection? Because it's Rene Girard who kind of is the founder of this, or
Right.
the head of this idea. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, this philosophical kind of layer. And one thing I do want to say is that I don't hold to scapegoat theory over and against all other theories. It's just one that not that many people know of, that explains so much of, especially what's going on with society today, cancel culture and things like that. Cancel culture is mimetic desire. Like that's the reason why we're canceling people, is because we're trying to find, we all desire something, this type of moral exemplar of what it means to be the woke person, and we find those who do not align with it, and so we have to sacrifice people to that because that's that impulse.
Okay, and why do you think we do that? Do we do that in this sense of justice, or is it a sense of trying to not be the scapegoat yourself, or can it be potentially both?
I think it's potentially both, but it is a certain type of justice, though. It's a deterrence form of justice, not like it's not a retribution or restorative justice. It's literally like a deterrence, like we're gonna make an example out of you,
so that no one else does it.
So no one else does it, and that's some people would say that's possibly not even justice, really. Like, I can see where they're going with that. So when I say justice, I want to make sure that, like I say, it's that form of justice, deterrence, which is arguably not actually justice, but yeah, so like that, and then also not necessarily doing it so that they don't get that it doesn't turn on them consciously, but maybe that I agree that someone's to blame, and it's very hard to say I'm to blame. And so to your point about with the Old Testament, with the sacrificial, I do think that sets the precedence for this thing itself. And I think it ties into why the lamb had to be pure, unblemished, innocent, and stuff like that. It's like it's preparing you and giving those seeds of this person that we're laying the sins on is innocent, and it like finally has this cultivation in the character of Christ.
Right. So how did you come across this theory?
That's a good question. I can't remember, actually.
Just a YouTube spiral one night,
YouTube
probably.
Spiral, probably. Yeah. Actually, and you know what? This might be how I came across it. You ever heard of Vsauce? Vsauce is like this YouTube channel. He actually got bought by YouTube, I believe. He's like actually officially YouTube, but he's one of the early ones. He do a science type of channel.
Okay.
Where he would go on like, how does the Earth move? And he would like do this like 15 to 25 minute thing on that, and then how are psychedelics affecting, and then what it's like to be, all these different questions, like how much does a shadow weigh, and what color are mirrors, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
And one of them was the invention of blame, and he goes through Rene Girard's scapegoat theory. So if you look at Vsauce, it's called the invention of blame, and it goes through the Rene Girard scapegoat, and I was like, wow, that's crazy, like. And this guy did a episode on that, and I was like, well, this is just mind blowing.
So, in your mind, the scapegoat theory is not this overall theory, this Trump theory, but you think that it's almost an extra layer to be combined with maybe another theory?
Yeah, combined. Like I would want to like dismiss the whole, paying the debt, or even Christus Victor or more exemplar. I definitely hold to moral exemplar, but
explain that. What?
Moral exemplar is the idea that Jesus Christ died as a thing for you to imitate, not necessarily that there's a transaction along with it, or even a sense of sin debt like that. And again, not to say that isn't the case, but that Christ dying is a good example for us to imitate. Not that I would necessarily do that myself. I believe in that idea. But that's the moral exemplar, that Christ died so that he can give us an example to imitate.
Yeah, something to point to or look
Right.
forward to. And so then that in this combination with scapegoat theory then would be like, because he was this moral exemplar, it became clear, it became so apparent that people started to look in on themselves and say, oh, wait. And I mean, I guess it wouldn't have been everybody.
No.
So what do you think is that thing that separates the people who see that mimetic desire versus the people that don't? Like, is it emotional? Is it psychological? Is it experiential? I mean, it's probably a combination of all of them.
Yeah, it's probably a combination of both, all of those. I think the thing that shocks, it's like, I guess on a communal level, on a community level, the experience of when you do realize, oh man, we really messed up, we got rid of somebody who was good, that's where the community comes aware of it. And then on an individual level, you process that as, I have the ability to be the hand that actually, wrongly does this. So perhaps I need to look for the devil inside and stop blaming everything out there. And I think that the longer you hold to that idea that there's some of the devil in you that to blame, the better this type of thing is, I guess, cultivated.
Sure. So earlier you mentioned cancel culture, and there's obviously a bit of this represented in our culture. Do you think that how it manifests itself today, do you think that we are more seeped in that type of behavior, or do you think that it's just a new version of something that's always been?
I think it's coming out stronger because we've rejected religion, and so like when you have a religious, ideas at the apex, and then you destroy that, it just comes down and settles wherever it can, and perhaps the next level where it can do it is on the political realm, and so basically you get like political religiosity. And so you're going to like embody religious impulses on the political scheme, and that's why I think it's doing that right now. So it should be held in the abstract and the mysterious, even the mysterious realm. Like, it's unknown, it's mysterious. I don't know who's the innocent one. I can't always identify who's the bad guy. But now it's easy to identify the good guy and the bad guy.
Is it?
Well, I mean, to them, to the woke people, it's like the people who just repeat and parrot these things about what you should believe and what you should do, and anybody who doesn't fall in line, it's obviously the bad guy, right? And so it becomes ridiculously easy to find out who's good and bad according to that framework,
Right.
And thus it will repeat itself.
Well, it's interesting because I think on both extremes you have that sort of frame, that black and white of like, well, clearly if you fall in line with this, you're on the right side of history versus the wrong side of history. It manifests itself in both ways, in the same spirit, in different ways. And so it's a very interesting pattern and culture that we have. And it's hard because I think for myself, I look at it and a lot of it is, I think, very well intended, of people trying to correct injustice and create a space where, we're not having this continued pattern of perpetration of evil in the community. But there becomes a tricky battle of who is the other, and a bit of a self-righteousness of thinking that we could never fall into that trap ourselves, or being so quick to paint somebody as something without understanding the full context, or being willing to work with somebody who maybe does have a wrong idea to have a conversation to get more right, instead of saying they're too far gone to ever be redeemable.
Yeah.
That's what I sort of see within cancel culture. And so there's this weird balance where it's like there's something in it that has this seed of what looks like something good that's so easily corruptible. And yeah, I guess for me, it's always question how do we operate in that, because we can't help but make moral judgment calls, right? Like we all have these instincts and these ideas of what's good and bad, and no one's moral judgment calls are completely identical to somebody else's, for a variety of reasons. But there's that level of how do we avoid this sort of scapegoating of the innocent, or scapegoating of maybe even the not innocent, but the
convenient,
the raw,
expedient person.
yes, exactly,
Yeah.
the thing that's most expedient
Yeah.
and the most likely target.
Mm-hmm. I don't know the full way to start. Well, I guess I would start with this: is that there's something wrong with always. I think people thinking that the person who's to blame is the one who stands out, because I think there's a reason to believe that the person who stands out could be the savior, right? So when the society has gone wrong in one way, then the savior is the one who stands out. But when the society is good, I guess the criminal or the devil is the standout, right? But just assuming that what we all say is the right thing at all times is like, it actually, I think, just statistically can't possibly be true.
Right. There's
So
an arrogance to that, and we live that way often. That we're always in the place of assuming that we are correct and defending those things. And I don't say that I'm immune to that. I find myself in that, and I think in the last couple of years I've tried to fight that and learn how to strip that away in the best way I can. But yeah, there's something interesting about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the parts in the Bible where Jesus talks to the disciples, he says, "One of you will betray me," and maybe it was Peter who goes like, "Is it I, Lord?" Right? That's like, I think that's one of the ways to keep this in wraps is like, whenever you see someone, whenever the idea of comes up, who's the devil in the group or who's the bad person, you should always be like, oh, could it be me? And if you go an extended period of time without ever asking that, you're losing the practice of watching out for the fact that you could be one of the perpetrators that killed the scapegoat.
Right. Well, it's so interesting, this idea of sin, where we want it gone, we want it removed, we want all evil to be destroyed. There's something in us that like wants that kind of justice, and then you start to recognize that the evil that lives out in the world lives in myself too. Like, I've perpetrated evil myself. I've done the wrong thing, and in a certain way, to destroy all evil, like there's a part of me that has to die, and that's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is, but unavoidable.
Yeah.
That's like,
Death is coming for us all, isn't it?
Death is coming for us all, and the longer you go without having that part of you die, the worse life gets, I think, as far as you go, because so you get married and you just never come to terms with your faults, and then you get married, and then all of a sudden you got another person there that's around you all the time.
Yeah.
It's going to be a matter of time before they pick up on them, and then because you have become callous, are you all of a sudden going to blame the other person for your own faults and why you did these things? And obviously that's going to destroy. And then if you divorce and get remarried and you still haven't fixed those things, that's going to make things worse. And then perhaps you have children, and then they perpetuate it, and you never realize it. It's just
right. There's this hard sort of expectation in relationships in a modern sense, where it's like, well, I want to be with someone who never wants to change me. And there's a level in which where, like, yeah, nobody ever wants to feel manipulated or forced into being changed. But there is something about, relationships being that character check and that thing that changes you. And the only way that it works is if you're willing to be changed yourself. You know, it's like if one person tries to change the other person who doesn't want to be changed, like it's, you know, it creates this friction, something's going to break. But, you know, it's finding this way of two individuals wanting themselves to be changed. And then it creates this dichotomy where you have these very, you know, often opposite people, or, you know, maybe not completely, but there's always going to be this tension. And because there's this immediate desire within each individual, be like, I want to be changed. Yes, it's painful and it's gritty, but then there creates something like stronger and more beautiful.
Yes.
And yeah, I think there's something that can be replicated with that in society too. And that's I think for me, especially when we're talking about politics, where I think I became much healthier, because for a long time I didn't care about politics at all. There's still a part of me that doesn't care about politics. I think it's a big game, but you know, I understand the importance of it. And you know, I just didn't want to be involved in it at all. And but I recognized after a while that there was something in me that never questioned, am I wrong? And how do I know? And when I started doing that, when I started approaching things in conversations with people about politics, where it wasn't me trying to change their mind, but me trying to, you know, find truth and be swayed myself towards that, I had a lot more interest. And I felt like, you know, I probably made mistakes along the way of trying to have those conversations and figure out how to do that. But I felt like I was more open and malleable to, like, one, hearing other people's opinions, questioning whether, you know, I was right or wrong, and feeling more confident in being able to, you know, stand for something that I believed. And I think often that's where the division and the divisiveness just keeps feeding on each other, because there's this constant battle to protect ourselves from being wrong. And yeah, it breaks my heart, because I think there are so many people who have, you know, similar values or goals that they want to move towards, but different practical ways of the way they think that can become a reality. And we villainize each other so often for a party line.
Yeah, and what you're doing, where you're talking to people who have a different view, it kind of, I guess you could call it vaccinates you from, or kind of, I don't know, prepares you in a way that you already have real experience to know that this person who maybe you thought, you know, you meet a Trump supporter and find out, oh, wow, this guy's actually, he loves his, you know, loves his mom.
He loves his mom.
He doesn't want to eat, like, you know, eat his babies and things like, you know, like they're actually real people. And then so your sensitivity to just jump and say, this person who doesn't mimic my, you know, this person my desire, if something's going wrong, it's got to be like, what is this person values not aligned? And then there's a sense of where we have this desire to be validated in what we want to, like, well, I want the good things, and you don't like this? Like, are you telling me that I want something wrong? It's, I guess we just look to each other so much. We look to each other so much, and it's not always helpful. Just imitating.
Yeah, it's hard, because we almost can't, we can't avoid that. There's always going to be a part of us that is always reflecting, like, what it means to be humanity, and the good, the bad, like the light and the dark, and like the death and the life. We're constantly seeing that in others and having that reflected onto us and challenge us. But there is something where to live in one extreme or the other, too self-involved and self-critical, can be just as damaging as being too overly attentive about what everybody else cares about and what everybody else is standing for or saying. And there's how do we strike this balance of being able to check within ourselves of the things that we hold to be true and personally believe, and reflect that with the differences and all of those personal beliefs of the people outside of us.
Yes, that's a good question. I think my first instinct is that if you desire something and you feel it really strong, but you know it's going to cost you possibly your reputation, and with other people, but you still something in you tells you that this is really worth it. I think that's like kind of a existential way of feeling it out.
Mm.
When because you don't want to throw that away, that's like a foundation itself. Like when you find that thing that's like, people aren't aligned with me in this desire, but I know that there's something really important about this, and I'm willing to lose in order to, have this goal, this thing. It's something that makes you, I would say possibly, this is going into kind of like really abstract of what I think it is that I think I heard Jordan Peterson say this, that awe, the experience of awe, is the manifestation of the evolutionary impulse of imitation itself. So when you have something that you just have this awe towards, that's the king mimetic desire. So the actual pure raw manifestation of, like, if I feel awe towards something, that is the direct connection to the image of God itself, I guess you could say, or the spirit of God. And that I should always like try to hone and pay attention to what brings me to awe, rather than just imitating what other people seem to be in awe about.
Do you think that there's something within the things that bring us awe that are reflecting something bigger than ourselves? You could almost say something divine. Do you think that there's something within those deeply held desires that's pointing us to something bigger?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's in the Bible, it says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that it's actually fear that's talking about. I think it's awe. Mm-hmm. And I think that even evolutionarily, what brought human beings to like self-consciousness was experiencing awe, and the things that make us feel awe are the things that are kind of connected to God. And I think that's the beginning of God in our consciousness to a certain extent. So yeah, the awe is pointing to God, which is transcendent. And I think that's the most reliable existential feeling that actually connects to God.
Okay, I have a question for you. Do you think that people can actually live without religion? Do you think people can live without God?
Without organized religion, yes. But without the religious impulse, no. I don't think that society will ever rid itself of its religious impulse, and religiosity will come up for a very long time. Perhaps 100,000 years from now, that will be different, but not anywhere near like within the next 1,000 years. Just for the fact that it pops up in random places that have nothing to do with organized religion, like people believing that you can throw your chi at another person in martial arts and like kill them with stuff like that. It's like that comes from the same place as the religious impulse. People believing in ghosts, and there's just so much there that it just pops up in these, QAnon. That's like a religious impulse. So no, I don't. I think they can live without organized religion, but not without manifestations of religion. And it's better to be organized, to me, to a certain degree, not overly organized.
Why do you say that? Why is it good to have organized religion? There's so many people against it.
Because it's a matter of intention, I guess you can say. You're doing things on purpose, to where it's kind of like haphazard. And so I think that you should be attentive to what you're doing religiously and do it on purpose. There is room for kind of spontaneity, but the more religious you are without being aware of it, the more likely you're going to repeat the crucifixion of Christ and scapegoat, because you're letting you're letting that impulse go beneath the surface, and I think that if you're just going to autopilot, it's more likely going to happen again.
So how much of our culture do you think are on autopilot religion?
Vast majority. I would say like at least 85%.
Okay, and do you think it's politics where it manifests itself the most, or do you think that there's other places that are more prominent of this sort of manifestation of religion that people wouldn't call religion, but mimics organized religion in a lot of ways?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I don't have like the super research on this, but I would say politics though.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I found peculiar was just the response to Colin Kaepernick. Like, so Colin Kaepernick, when he kneeled for the flag, that was like offensive. And I get it that people don't like that, but at the same time, symbolically, kneeling could be associated with respect. So I was like, okay, so why don't people think it's respectful? And they were like, oh, well, this is what he meant. And then it's like, do people, when they put their hand over their heart, do they necessarily mean something good? And there was like this deep understanding that the symbol of him kneeling was like heretical even. And that to me was a sign that what he did was he blasphemed or committed heresy on our civic religion. Like we have like an American religion, and that's what he like basically blaspheming our gods.
But on the other side, there was people who were making him a hero, right? He was the savior figure, right? The one taking on the sacrifice, becoming that scapegoat to do something good. And so is there these two different sects of political religions that are continuing the bloodbath of holy wars?
Yeah, I give a little bit less credence to the ones who thought he. So the people who thought Colin Kaepernick was a hero, but because he was denigrating the United States, I think those people are like, that's the bad side. But the people who thought that he was actually standing for America by doing that, that I give more credence to, because I don't know. I feel like to want to uplift somebody because they are stepping on the values of a bunch of people publicly, that can be good sometimes, but I don't know. I just
it's a tricky game.
It's
I mean, how did you see it when Colin Kaepernick kneeled? Like, did you see it as him standing for America or against it?
I guess that's why I felt that way, is because I was like, it was ambiguous to me. Like, because people would say that he meant bad, and I was like, I don't know. Like,
yeah.
And people would, here's what really changed my mind about it. I learned about that people were saying that he was against the military and stuff like that, and there's a person, I think it was an army or marine. It was a marine or army recon. I don't know, whatever like the high level of army is. I think it's recon. But one of the people who was like high level military was the person who told him to do that. And so basically, because I think he sat down at first, and then that military person was like, okay, so don't sit down. That's disrespectful. You should kneel. And then he kneeled, and people were like, that's disrespectful to the military. And I was like, it came from a military person, and yet you're saying it's disrespectful to the military, and it's because you know his intentions. And it was like, this is like a weird, like, superstitious type of thing that was happening there to me.
Right. Well, I think for myself, I very rarely will want to put bad intentions on people. I understand realistically there are bad actors, there are people who are, doing things out of bad places. But I think for most people, when they operate in bad ways, they're doing it for the greater good, right? So to me, there's like, okay, whatever Colin Kaepernick is doing, like, I don't imagine his motives are to be bad. even if that like he is being disrespectful or whatever. And I wouldn't go that far. I don't have strong opinions about this, to be honest, but I know a lot of people do. And I think there is something about this, you kind of nailed it with that mimetic desire of this perception of what you think they're doing and placing that on them and living with certainty that that's what it was meant to be the whole time.
Right.
And then never giving people a chance to either redeem themselves or explain fully and look at something in the full context.
Yeah.
And obviously, Colin Kaepernick becomes one of these figures on the left who's been persecuted by the right. But then you have people like like Donald Trump or the kid in the MAGA hat. With the drum, they become this opposite on the right. And so you see these patterns playing within both worlds, and there's obviously these patterns that are pointing us to something. Like, to me, it seems like it's pointing us to something bigger outside of ourselves. But there's a level of like our humanity is corrupting it because we're choosing what is good and evil on our own terms.
One of the things that's interesting with this is what I did like some thought experience with people on the Colin Kaepernick thing. So like, let's say what he did, he meant it he meant to be bad. The other thing that happened is like everyone who would do it after him also meant it for bad. And I was like, because people would say that kneeling itself now means in all instances, no matter who's doing it, what Colin Kaepernick meant. Right. And I was like, how do you get to the point where you actually own a symbol like that and it's potent? Like, it's just like, this was like a transfer of like power religiously, symbolically, that everybody just like kind of was like, this, it happened, but then nobody like questioned like this is a moment in history where now this symbol is like forever tied to him. And then how long is it tied to it? How long does it happen? After 50 years, then can we go back? Can we actually reappropriate kneeling? Or I like nobody had thought about that. I was like, it just seems very religious to me.
Yeah, well, and when you're sort of talking about like how long does this symbol mean this? I think we live in a modern world that's it's a clickbait world, and it's a 24-hour news cycle where we can't even remember what happened yesterday. And so we lose sight of the fact that we're this tiny moment in time that has like been led up to by like an unspeakable amount of time before us. And I do think that there's something in us that we have this arrogance to say this is what this means for certainty, and we know that because of this led to this and that's why this is bad. And it's like there's so much that came before us that it's far more complicated than we're ever going to be fully able to comprehend. And like, it doesn't mean that we can't know things,
right?
But it does create a dangerous dynamic here. It's like, how do we really look outside of just our small scope, our small lived experience, to understand the bigger lived experience, not only in the culture that we live in today, but how it's been repeated for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, like millions of years, to potentially, Yeah,
we definitely have a very limited scope of what we try to keep in our minds. And like you said, 24 hours, it's very short.
Yeah.
Amnesia.
Do you think that social media and the way that media is consumed now has created this bigger sense of mimetic desire within our culture?
Yes. It seems that way to me. It seems that it's like amplified it to where because it's almost as though things aren't real unless they occur on that stage. You know what I mean?
Yeah, picture it didn't happen. you
Yeah,
know?
picture. Yeah, exactly. So like things are like it's like nope, that didn't happen. It's not real unless it happened on that
Yeah,
stage.
if I didn't share it on my news feed, like my Facebook news feed,
Right.
then, does it matter?
Right. And that's a strange type of situation.
Yeah.
And I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't amplify it too much because it's the reason. Another reason why I'm interested in scapegoat theory is because if you think what I said, it was we imitate the desire, and then what we do is when things go wrong, we find somebody who seems different, right? Well, I'm a black guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it possible?
I don't see color.
But is it possible that in the past this type of desire has led to things like lynching, where there's this thing, there's who's not like us, this black person, right? And so like let's say you're like one of the few black people, one of the few black families in town, they were like, something with this church got burnt down, who was it, or this bank got robbed, who was it? It was like the person who doesn't look like us, right? And when they went after Jesus, they're like, he's a Galilean, right? Or like that, or I can tell that he's that because he doesn't speak like us, his accent betrays him, things like that. So that type of thing obviously can lead to Christ crucified. It can lead to black people being at the even Martin Luther King, like all these things where it's like this person stands out, and my recent history has it to where like I'm black, like that was like that thing was going loose and coming after people like me, so it's important for me to remember that because I could be on the receiving end of that, and I have a higher likelihood to be a receiving end of it because I do try to cultivate my own desire, and I'm disagreeable. So.
No, you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting because all of these things to me have these double-edged swords, and I don't know if I'm a contrarian, but I'm definitely sort of that challenger where it's like, yes, but, and always like trying to think of it on the other head and turn it on its head. And there's so much, I think there's just so much of these patterns that play themselves out on both extremes that lead to the same, forgetting that we can repeat those mistakes, and then it can manifest itself in a different pattern. And these patterns that have come before can flip themselves on their head and manifest themselves in a different way, but have the same results. And it just continues to show us these patterns of the world that works. And I think there's something beautiful about Christianity in being willing to basically sacrifice or, lay down your own desire of what you think is right, to be willing to come under a framework that is bigger than yourself, and that, you put your trust into, that will teach you something about how to, remove this death that is constantly in the world and these continual patterns of evil that are like being perpetrated. And I think it's hard because there's so much corruption and arrogance and misunderstanding in the way that we talk about religion and the way that we stand for the things we believe to be true. And I think most people are doing it for the right reasons, right? They believe they're standing for the ultimate good, and that's part of the scary part.
Yeah. It makes me think, like, I guess you could tell me this, 'cause I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because with this thing, I've come to a place where I really do question the utility of blame itself. And I want to know, like, do you feel that there is, I guess I have a hard time seeing it, but do you think there is a utility in blame itself?
That's a good question. I'd have to think about that.
Right.
Because I think I think that in some ways to accept the blame for the things that you've done and to be willing to not torture yourself with it, but take that on and have accountability to it, that can be good. But there's this also it's like this weird paradox where there's all this utility of forgiveness where, you know, pure blame is, creates a bad society where, we're just self-deprecating for, self-deprecation. But, just like all total forgiveness isn't justice. And so it's almost, you need these two in harmony and unison to be able to work the way it's supposed to.
Right.
And I do think there's something right to what you're saying is like the best place to start with blame is to accept the blame ourselves, not to constantly take blame that it is not meant to, but be willing to take that responsibility for what have I done? How do I live in this world, and how do I escape this constant other blaming?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like accepting the blame, taking the responsibility, accepting sometimes the consequences and the punishment, but still learning how to forgive yourself, and then putting that out for others too. I think sometimes it's sometimes harder and easier to forgive others, right? It's easier to have more animosity and hatred against other people for doing something that you've probably done in your life. But on the other hand, it's like sometimes it's easier to forgive other people for that injustice than being able to say, oh, I get that forgiveness too. It probably just depends on our personalities. But yeah, I don't know. Life's full of these weird paradoxes.
Let me ask you about this. If you, because you said take on blame, responsibility. So if you decide to shoulder the responsibility, which could be like taking up your cross, but you decide to not take on the blame, like if you try to delineate those two, is there an advantage to take on the blame in addition to responsibility, or would you say that you take on the blame for the sake of yourself or the sake of this other person who needs someone to blame, or like what's in addition to responsibility, what is the utility of blame? Is it for other people? Would it be for you? Would it be like for?
I think that the blaming of others, when defined by us, is pointless. But I think that the level of, you talk about, someone was talking about this, I think on the Discord, about David when he slept with Bathsheba. He took her in, had sex with her, impregnated her, and then murdered her husband. And Nathan comes to him and says, there's a man with the sheep. Right. And he had all of this flocks, but he took this one man's sheep and killed it and used it for himself. What should this man do? Or what should be done to this man? Yeah. This man should be destroyed, ruined, like worst person ever. And then it goes, you are that man. Mm-hmm. There's something to that sort of blame where it's like we're blaming David, but in the same way that blame that he's put on others is turned on himself. And then it gets us to reflect on, I think there's something to reflect on the way that we look at sin and the way that we look at the evil perpetrated against us. And it helps us to get a better sense of how to model Christ, mm-hmm. and how to embody the divine and the way that it's actually it was meant and designed to be. But I mean, it's such a hard question to answer. And I always get so nervous speaking confidently about it because I've gotten to a place where it's like, I don't know. Like, I obviously have my own beliefs, but how it actually plays out, like I could be speaking heresy right now, and like my priest, he said something, there's a difference between, misunderstanding and heresy, where, misunderstanding, you can proclaim something that you think is true and try to stand and just be misunderstood versus like knowingly twisting something or refusing to acknowledge something that is true. And that's, oh my gosh, that's a whole rabbit hole. But yeah, when it comes to blame, I do think there's a utility, especially when it comes back to reflecting us, of understanding, you know, how to escape the mimetic desires and how we fall into those patterns. And I think the only way that it can truly be just is by, understanding that there's something divine bigger than us that has this moral law that he wants us to follow for whatever reason. We might never fully understand that reason, but like understanding that, and that if that does exist and there is this type of person or being that can do this, that's the only kind of blame that we should truly feel is worth anything.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that God's message possibly in one weird way could have been by sending Christ is that we should blame him?
No, I mean, I don't think that. I think there's a part of it that's, you know, in the garden, what was the original sin? A lot of people's like knowing good and like the tree of knowing good and evil. But I don't think that's actually what was meant by that. I think it was more of that defining good and evil on our own terms and deciding that for ourselves was the original sin. And I think because they took that fruit before God allowed them to, like, it's, you know, it's not knowing good and evil that's bad. Like, that's actually a really good thing. And that's how God is working with us, you know, and revealing himself to us to help us understand good and evil. Like, now we have to do it through this long, you know, cohesive, like, or crazy path to kind of get rid of death in our world that we've like birthed. But, you know, there's a part of it that's like, you know, allowing God to teach us good and evil as opposed to fully taking that on ourselves is part of this journey that we're on. And I don't know if I believe this or how true it is, but there's something to be said that in the end we'll understand that, you know, it's not a certain, and I don't even know who has this theory, and I'm not saying I believe it, or, you know, I'm agnostic to it at this point, but there's something that there's no action that in it of itself is good or bad. There's something about the way that we work in relationship with each other and how we manifest those things that end up, you know, being good and bad. And because we decided to take that on for ourselves, there are certain barriers that God has given us within the moral law to protect us and to teach us about what it really means to be human and to look at another person as an image bearer of Christ and see them as worthy. But yeah, I mean, that's probably controversial for a lot of people. And like I said, I don't know if I would say I believe that, but it's interesting. It's an interesting concept to like play with in your head.
Do you think that it would be psychologically or maybe even spiritually a bad practice to ever blame God?
I mean, it's hard for me to encourage it, you know, just to, cause especially if, you know, because I do believe there's a God that exists, and I believe he's embodied in love and truth and all things that are good, like the fullness of that. And so I'd be so hesitant to take that position, because then I put myself in the position of God to define good and evil for myself. But I think there's something within the biblical narrative that at least God allows us to do these things. You read Job, and like, not that he blamed God, but like there was something about him cursing his death and fighting with God. And you read through the Psalms and David sort of struggling with God, and even Israel, that idea of it meaning to wrestle with God. There's something about that he allows that, and there's something good that can come from that. But it doesn't mean that every action within that is good. But I don't know. It's that I'd have to think about that, because like, is blame always bad?
Right. I guess the way I feel about it is that the beginning of a psychological awakening? Like, if you do blame God, is it like that you come to a point where you're like, okay, so I blame God, so what do I do now? It's like,
Right.
like what is like if you do, it's like, okay, God's to blame, and then what do you do? It's just like, do you fall into resentment and like, you know, do something like terrorist attack, or do you come back and be like, it felt good to say that, but that doesn't make me feel better. And
I mean, it definitely has the ability to manifest and grow into a lot of different ways. And so that's that idea of like, how you know, when you blame God, and how is that going to manifest itself, and what is it going to grow?
yeah.
And that idea of God, you know, pruning and cutting down the bad, like we need that. And sometimes we can't even recognize in ourselves what's bad until, you know, it's you know, beat out of us in a certain way. So it's like, I mean, I think there's something that God allows us the ability to do that. And so he obviously sees some sort of good that can come from it. But does it mean that itself is good? I don't know. I guess, yeah, and I guess it really would depend on what you mean by blame. Because, you know, it's like, oh, you know, words are funny. They can have different weight for other people.
Yeah, because I guess this thing I'll say is that when I think about, like, you know, what does blame mean, it seems to carry a form of judgment, right? So you're judging God, and then it's almost like, how strongly do you want to hold to that judgment?
Right.
And if you are light with it, okay, you can judge God as bad, and be like, obviously I don't know what I'm talking about, you know, and then it doesn't seem to be as much of an infraction. But if you do say, no, God is bad, and I'm like, and you're the person who holds to each other, like, I can't, no, I'm certain that God is bad, and then it's like,
well, there's something to the idea that judging in and of itself is not bad. Like, we can look at our legal system. We have judges who are supposed to bring justice,
right.
And depending on how we look at it, they did that or they didn't. You know, they you know, did a miscarriage of justice, or they, you know, they're moving forward in the right steps. And so the idea of us being able to judge, we're designed to. We can't help but make judgments, value judgments, snap judgments. But how do we let those judgments manifest? And do we let the dark side of us, the deadly part of us, overtake that ability to judge and become the person pointing the finger at the goat?
do we refrain from judging God as bad because we're in like a secret deal with him that I don't tell you you're bad, and you won't tell me that I'm bad?
Well, I think if for God to be worthy of worship, this is how I have made it in my head, like, there can't be bad. It's the epitome. Like, God is the epitome of all good. And so it's that absence of bad. And C.S. Lewis, I forget where he wrote it, but he talked about that idea of like good and evil. It's like, you can have something that's purely good, but, you know, but there are things that, like, it's like sin is like rust, where it's like, you can have metal with the absence of rust, and it's good, but you can't have rust without metal, right? because then it wouldn't exist. It's that corruption of the good thing. And so that's how I almost see, God. Like, God is this whole thing. He can't be bad, or he wouldn't be God.
Do you think that, like, on a personal level, not you, but other people, do you think there's people who suspect that God might be bad, but they don't want to actually come to terms with that because it could reveal something bad about them?
Totally. I think we probably all struggle with that in different ways. I don't think I've ever struggled with the idea of God being good. And, I think I could make sense in my head that even though there was this evil, and even though I've experienced evil, I can see how he can use those things for good. And I look at my own life, and I think sometimes the worst things that I experienced gave me the truest sense of what it meant to be human. And it gave me humility to see other people as people, and it stopped me from continuing that cycle of that judgment and that blame and the finger pointing. And so it's like, yeah, like on paper, this looks terrible. This is really bad. But it showed me what love truly was. And so for me, like, yeah, I can wrestle with that. But, I found a way to not hold to that trap. And will that change in my life? Could something so terrible happen to me that I lose that? Yeah, it's a potential. I hope not, because I just don't think it's a beautiful way to live. I think it just, when you really look at the life where that leads in the patterns of how it manifests in people's lives, I don't see full beauty coming from that. I see corruption more than good. I don't know.
Yeah. You answer me.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you think that there's a point of no return? Like, or do you think that you can go to the depths to a certain degree like that?
I don't know. It's hard for me to, like, I never want to say there's no one redeemable. Like, it just seems wrong to me, like in the deepest sense of me, to say that nobody's ever redeemable. Do I always act like that? No, there's plenty of times I act like someone's not worth my time or not worth protecting. But yeah, there's something in me that says no one's unredeemable. But there's times in the Bible where it's like someone gave in to these mimetic desires, if you will, like Pharaoh. He gave into this hardness of heart, refusing to, do what is just, letting these people go and doing what they ask. And God hardened his heart and let him loose to that. And, it ended up being to his destruction. But, it's really complicated. I can't say I know. What do you think?
I don't know the point. I think there is a point of no return, and then that there's a natural fear to not go in that direction, because perhaps how far can you go into delving into resentment that you have for God? But then, is that the valley that you go through to reach the next mountaintop?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely truth to the fact that resentment and that just hardening eventually gets you a place where you break, and you need that brokenness to then soften you up to see the bigger thing. And as much, and maybe it's the challenger in me, but as much as that like sounds awful, like there's something beautiful to that. Like you're broken to the point, where like you then have to just admit that there is something bigger than you could ever imagine, and it creates that softness in you to then go and live with like true life. I don't know. I mean, maybe it sounds masochistic, but
I'm like that too. I'd be down for the challenge. I mean,
yeah,
I have to have some type of challenge in life.
Well, it would be boring.
Yeah, it would be very boring. It would be. If I died without it, it would make me feel as though I wasted my life if I didn't have a challenge like that to a degree.
Well, and I think a lot of times when we really look back at our lives and, what we did, what we accomplished, how we've lived, a lot of times it's like the admiration of like, I made it through this heartbreak. I made it through this tragedy. I moved away from this sin that like enslaved me. That often is the thing that we look to besides like, like it was fun having the family dinner, but there's something bigger about taking on that thing and morphing it and see the way that it can bring life. So yeah, I mean, I could see how that all works within the pattern of God and how we see him and why he might allow that. But yeah, it's hard for me to speak confidently to say there's no reason why I could see if God would allow evil. It's like that's putting me in a position I don't want to be in.
Yeah.
But I tend to be a very like, in some ways I'm very spontaneous and, whatever. But then there's another part of me that's very hesitant and almost like conservative, where it's like, I don't want to break past a barrier, past what I don't know what it is. But, there's, I'm a walking contradiction.
We all are.
Yeah. Well, any last words? Any sort of final thoughts?
No, it was good. I'm glad we did this. Got to experience what it's like to be on a more official podcast.
I'm not official. I've got like 100 people. I just pretend I'm official. Well, thanks for coming. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I did too. It was great. I'm glad we did this.
Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will close with a serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.